Deckboard spacing generally needs to be about 5mm gap between each board, and then that allows the water to run off between the gaps in the boards. As far as framework goes, your joists need to be around 400mm joist centres. If you make them too wide and you make them sort of 600mm wide, or some people have even gone even wider, then that's the reason why you get board movement and flexing between the joists. So you need to keep the joist spacings at 400mm, and then intersperse those rows of joists with noggins or shorter pieces of softwood just to lock it up, so you're creating effectively a grid section, and therefore that framework is solid, it moves, it works as one unit as opposed to separate joists. And then when you come to put the boards on, as long as you've made sure that deck is level and you've spirit leveled it, so you haven't got ups and downs in the framework. When it comes to building decks, the one thing we wouldn't recommend, and we don't recommend, is that you put the framework together with a nail gun and then you nail the boards down. The screws, you should be using screws because they're stronger, they hold wood together. You have to bear in mind that if you're using, for example, a softwood framework, then that's going to expand and move slightly with the weather, being a softwood. So therefore, screws, if you screw the framework together with decent screws like 6x80s or 5x80 screws, then the framework will stay together, it won't move, providing you've run the relevant noggins into it and locked it up as a proper grid. And then the same thing, obviously, with the deck boards, you need to use stainless screws, or you could use the coated screws if you're doing a softwood, depending on what application you want to use. But we would always recommend you steer away from using nail guns. When you're using a softwood deck framework, there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. You don't have to go down the aluminium or other composite route. If you went down a composite framework, you have to bear in mind that they can't cope with the same joist spacings, so you'd have to have a lot more upright supports to stop any movement in that, and it'll also expand and contract being a recycled plastic frame. The best way of using a pressure treated framework is to, apart from screwing all the framework together, you treat the cut ends with end grain sealer to preserve it, because at the end of the day that's generally where insects will try and go in, because that's the easiest route into timber. So you always treat the cut ends with end grain sealer. And the other thing to bear in mind is, before you put the deck boards down, if you stapled a 4-inch strip of DPC, which is used most commonly for brick courses when you're building, if you just laid that down the joist and then just tacked it in various places to obviously stop the wind from blowing it off the joist, and then just run a screwdriver or something down the side of each joist just to put a crease in it, then you lay your framework, your deck boards onto it. The advantage of that is that when the water runs off the deck board, instead of migrating under the deck board itself and getting trapped between the underside of the deck board and the frame, that's the most common reason for framework starting to rot, and you don't realise it until it's too late. By putting this membrane on it, it means that when the water drips through between the two deck boards, it'll hit that membrane and then just drip straight off, and you'll end up with a dry frame. So the framework won't get wet from any rain, and as long as there's airspace underneath the frame and it's not physically sitting on the ground or in damp conditions, then your framework will last a long time. I mean, in our situation, we've had frameworks that have been lasting for 20 years. And having said that, when we were designing and building projects, we were repairing other people's projects, and some of those didn't last more than 6 months. And it's all down to how it's been built. So as long as you think about the build process, then you won't go far wrong. And the other thing about using posts is you need to bolt the posts to the framework. Don't just fire screws in, because over a period of time they could end up shearing. So you bolt support posts, or 4x4 inch posts, to the side of the framework, and that way everything will last. Normally the bolts are around 10mm, 10 or 12mm in diameter. Once you've completed all your deck framework and the time comes to start cutting and fitting all your deck boards, think about using something like the Messmer's wax end grain sealer. The reason is that every cut end needs to be retreated, or needs to be treated just as you would do with a softwood frame. And softwood deck boards, you coat the ends with an end grain preservative. In the case of hardwoods, or even in softwoods, if you treat the end with a wax end grain sealer before you lay the deck board itself, then you'll stop the end grain on the board splitting. And the main reason you get end grain checking on boards is because of the rapid loss of the moisture So the uptake and the loss of the moisture in deck boards travels quickly out of the end grain, out of the ends of the boards. So if you treat it with a wax sealer, I mean this looks white when you open the tin, but it dries clear, then that slows that process down. You don't end up getting the ends of the boards checking quite so regularly, and it will also add to the longevity of the boards themselves. So it's all about thinking about the whole process. But this wax end grain sealer is on our website. It's only in a small 500ml tin. I think it costs around about £20 or something or other, but it's well worth it, and it will mean that your boards will last longer and look better for a longer period of time.